when you step away from the norm in any way, it's going to influence the way that people interface with you, the way that people treat you, the assumptions they make about you when they see you. And I think it just made my childhood that much more complicated.
That's Eris Young, and the norm they stepped away from in middle school that caused some difficulty was the gender binary, the idea that there are two discrete genders, boy and girl, man and woman, end of story. Today there's a growing chorus of scientists, biologists, psychologists, and other specialists who are making it clearer than ever that the gender binary doesn't capture the diversity of human experiences. This includes trans people and also people who don't fall so neatly into one category or another. In this episode, Eris Young joins us to talk about their book, They, Them, There, A Guide to Non-Binary and Genderqueer Identities. I'm journalist Blair Hodges, and this is Relationscapes. We're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other so we can build a more just world together. Eris Young, welcome to Relationscapes. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Blair. I'm really happy to be here.
We're talking about a book you published called They, Them, There. And these are pronouns, obviously, and they're pronouns that you use. And your introduction to this book, actually, it kind of starts off with a glossary of 16 terms, and you managed to actually keep it interesting. We'll talk about those terms, but I think it says a lot that you had to spend time right off the bat with direct definitions. Talk a little bit about that decision for the book.
Yeah, of course. It is a bit odd. You don't often start off with a dictionary or a glossary. I think because of the nature of the project and when it came out. So this book came out in 2019, and I started writing it in around 2017. And at that time, we were really at the very beginning of our understanding, at least sort of in the Anglophone West, of non-binary and genderqueer identities and trans identity in the mainstream. So for the book, I wanted to get into the nitty-gritty. I wanted to go deep as quickly as possible, but it meant that there was a lot of explaining that I had to do in a short space of time in order to be able to get past that kind of really basic stuff. And I will talk a little bit later about, I'll probably mention about how I feel about sort of glossaries and dictionaries and how that's changed over time. But it's very much a product of, where I was at, and I think where we as a sort of society were at when the book was written.
Mm. And you talk about in the top of the book how your target audience is people who want to understand but might not have the means yet. So this isn't necessarily for people that have already been in all the online discussions about non-binary and different gender identities, but for people that are trying to wrap their minds around it. And it can be a little intimidating for people that aren't used to those discussions in those spaces. And you talk about some of the factors that you're thinking about, like it might feel like people are afraid of making a mistake or something, so they're afraid to ask questions, or that they might feel like they're virtue signaling if they're going overboard and sort of trying to show how knowledgeable they are and stuff. So tell me a little bit more about those dynamics, as your target audience was for interested and well-meaning people that just want to learn more.
Yeah, it is kind of funny how much has changed in the time since I wrote the book. It's only been a couple of years. But when I first wrote it, I was very much, and I think that's the strength of the book, is that I was really doing what I could to reach as many people as possible. And that meant that, I had to do a little bit of explaining and a little bit of, making sure my readers were on the same page as me from the very beginning. And I've seen the book described as accessible. I've had a lot of people, cis people, sort of come up to me and just enthuse about the way that they were able to use the book to get to know the non-binary people in their life or to make their workplace more inclusive. I really value having been able to do that for people.
Yeah, you mentioned cisgender folks. So I'm cisgender. For people who aren't familiar with the terminology, that means that my gender identity aligns with the sex that I was assigned at birth, the assumptions that people made based on what my body looked like. And so I fit into typical male identity, and my body lines with that. And so cisgender, it means it's basically trying to, I think, get people to think about how cisgender itself is also an identity, that to be non-binary is an identity in the same way that being cisgender is an identity, and that it's trying to avoid hierarchies of comparison of better than or less than. And it's that term seems to serve kind of an equalizing purpose, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's absolutely an equalizer, and it's absolutely a way of sort of challenging this otherness. We kind of trans and gender nonconforming people, we tend to get placed into this other category, but really it's about sort of repositioning cis and trans as, you know, two categories of being on an equal footing with each other.
Okay, we'll expand on definitions as we go, but let's start here with kind of more about your own personal biography. This is a book that explores your own experiences. You're very personal here. You talk about what it was like growing up, and you say that you realized as a young child that there was something different about, or something uncomfortable maybe, about how you were encouraged to act and dress and speak and play as a child. Tell people a little bit about how that felt as a child, about how you were.
This has been something that I've thought about a lot over the years. And I think in comparison to a lot of people, a lot of genderqueer and non-binary people, I was fairly lucky. My parents are very sort of like liberal in the sense of being quite flexible parents. You know, they weren't very prescriptive. You know, I did karate, I did art lessons. So I was managed to avoid a lot of the really gendered activities. Not to say I was very good at karate or art, but and I think in that way I kind of dodged a bullet that a lot of people in my position don't always manage to avoid. So I'm very grateful to my parents for that. And, you know, I think the thing that is maybe changing, or that I really want to see changing, is, because when I was a little kid, especially, you know, an adolescent and in high school especially, I did feel different. You know, this has to do with my sexuality, my gender, my sort of neurodivergent stuff going on. Yeah, there were a lot of times when, if the adults in my life had had the opportunity to, you know, read a book or watch a TV program about transgender, about, you know, non-binary identity, that would have helped me a lot. And so this is kind of what I'm trying to give to the non-binary children, the trans children of the people that are, you know, reading my book. And I don't think, you know, it's going to make a huge difference, but I have had quite a few parents reach out to me, and I've had some really intense emotional conversations with parents who, you know, as you say, they're really well-meaning and they're really trying to understand, but they've been taught their whole lives that gender and sex work a certain way. You know, they're finding it difficult to try and engage while trying not to hurt the person, you know, the non-binary or trans person in their life.
That's right. I think there are a lot of different reactions that parents can have coming from a lot of different places. So some people might have very rigid ideas about sex and gender being, you know, inflexible, and gender assigned at birth is paramount. And so any kind of deviation from that is really uncomfortable or even evil or whatever. And then you have people who are more open to it, but might see societal discrimination and might worry for their kids, you know, if they're expressing as non-binary or as trans, and worry about discrimination that they would face, or maybe even just kind of the dreams that a parent has for their kids, where in theory they're all right with trans identities or non-binary identities, but they also kind of have built this story of who their kid was going to be, and then they have to let go of that story. So I think parental anxiety can come from a lot of different directions, and it's not limited to, I think, quote unquote conservative or traditionalist anti-trans necessarily feelings, but can also come from people who are open and believe and accept trans identities as well.
Yeah, so I think so much of parenthood and family is, you know, we're so close to it. For some people, it's the most sort of like fundamental and personal thing in their life. And that means that, you know, ego plays into it a lot, whether we want it to or not. I see this talking to a lot of asexual and aromantic people as well. We'll have parents who, you know, are good, supportive, loving parents, but, you know, when they encounter something that kind of disrupts their own ideas of what their family should look like, it can cause a lot of conflict. And something that I'm really hoping for, a kind of an idea that actually makes me quite emotional, that I'm hoping for the future, is to see more parents. I'd really like to see more parents approach their child's gender journey as not a challenge to them as a parent, or as not an obstacle to their idea of their child's, happy and stable future. Instead, I'd really like to see parents approaching their child's gender exploration and potential transition as kind of an adventure that you're going on together as a family. And, I think for a lot of people, this practically isn't possible because of the way, as you say, society right now makes it really hard to be trans or non-binary or genderqueer. But I'm really hoping that if we can have incremental social change such that in 10 or 20 or 50 years, we can celebrate it when our children decide that they're something other than they were assigned at birth. I think that's a really beautiful potential future, and I'd like to work towards it.
In the book, you also talk about some of the ways that you felt anxiety, even though your parents were generally supportive and it seems flexible and open to different things, but you also felt anxiety around like public restrooms or different social situations. So what were the pressures? Did you feel pressure to conform to the gender binary that you had to resist? And what did that pressure look like?
I think no matter who you are, there's a lot of pressure on you to conform to the sort of sex assignment that you were given at birth. And for me, like restrooms is a thing. We talk about it a lot. I still sort of have to navigate that, although a lot of it, nowadays when you're an adult, you can get away with pretty much anything by, walking in and looking like know what you're doing. But as a kid, I was quite a sort of, I don't know, I don't want to say like a little weirdo, but, I was quite a shy child. I was quite, I don't know, I was like a nervous little kid. And, being a sort of baby trans nascent, not really knowing anything about the community that I would later enter, it added this extra layer of complication on top of an already somewhat fraught, like I had a good childhood, but like I was just like a funny little guy. And it kind of made things.
You had some like anxiety.
Yeah. I definitely have had some anxiety like throughout my life, just for various, a lot to do with like being neurodivergent. So it kind of, let's see, what did it really look like? It kind of really started to come to the fore when I was in like middle and high school. So in my like early to mid teens. And, I did manage to...
Remind me, was this in California, right?
Yeah, California, Orange County.
Okay.
So we didn't really have like strict dress codes or anything. I was dressing in boys' clothes from like high school. But I think it more sort of influenced the way that people treated me and looked at me. When you step away from the norm in any way, it's going to influence the way that people interface with you, the way that people treat you, the assumptions they make about you when they see you. And I think it just made my childhood that much more complicated.
This speaks to the idea of, I think non-binary people are thought of as being like egocentric or sort of like self-obsessed in presentation and stuff. And what interests me about you is you were not like that. Like, it seems like you didn't want attention. You also needed to express your gender identity in a way that made you feel comfortable in your body and in yourself, but you weren't going for attention. It seems like, if anything, you kind of wanted to not get extra attention. Yeah,
it's funny because that is the stereotype, isn't it? But pretty much all of the trans and gender nonconforming people I know, myself included, we're just trying to live our lives. And because we're now able to be visible and open in a way that we never were before, it's like from going from invisible to visible is now sort of being transformed into this perception of us as being attention seeking. When you look at the ways that some cis people act out and perform their gender,
right?
Like don't even get me started. So it's just very funny that we do get painted with this kind of paintbrush, and it all has to do with visibility and change. It's not that we're visible or trying to be really obnoxious about it. It's that we exist, and our existence challenges the status quo and makes people think about things that they haven't had to think about before.
Okay, so your book also really drills down on gender, sex, and the binary. For people who aren't familiar with this way of thinking about sex and gender, it's really helpful. So the most common understanding of sex and gender is a binary understanding. The idea is that gender is determined by a person's physical body parts, their body morphology, maybe chromosomes or whatever. And that's also supposed to determine sexual orientation as well. So gender identity, sexual orientation, and sex are all thought to be one singular thing. And even in your book, you talk about like humans are loosely a sexually dimorphic species. There is a general view of like a sex male, a sex female. And so it's kind of easy to understand how we've arrived at these assumptions about sex and gender, but complicate that for us. Talk about why that binary understanding is problematic.
Yeah. So this is a really fun question with a lot of really deep potential. And I think one of the things that happened for me while I was writing They, Them, There was that the more research I did, the more it complicated that understanding. I was approaching it with an understanding that, well, some people are born, and I was like a sort of 20-year-old starting to write this book. And I approached it with an understanding of sort of like there is biological sex, and some people feel that they are not that, whatever they were assigned at birth. But in reality, the more you look at it and the more research you do and the more you look at history and actually biology, that sort of rigid, contiguous binary that we've constructed and that we've put on this pedestal in our society, it starts to crumble really quickly. And it like kind of broke my brain and put it back together. And that's part of why I'm so pleased that I was able to write this book when I did, because it really made a lot of things make much more sense to me very quickly. So, for example, well, if you look at that sort of, I guess I'm picturing like three boxes with arrows between them, and you've got biological sex equals gender equals sexuality. Well, a good 100 years ago, we started to disrupt this idea of gender equals sexuality. And that's, there's all sorts of different kind of historical categorizations of homosexual people, quote unquote, as sort of inverts, hermaphrodites. These are the sort of words that they're quite pathological words that were placed onto us or claimed by us at different times. So, we've pretty much disrupted that connection. And we've also managed to start with some setbacks, it's with some backlash. I mean, there's still backlash, against homosexuality, but we're starting to be able to decouple this idea of biological sex equals gender. We've got trans people, we've got non-binary people, all sorts of people who aren't cis. And in fact, we're also starting to come to understand that biological sex is not as much a scientific reality as we're taught to believe, or as some people would want us to believe. And this was something that was really revelatory for me as I was writing the book, is that it turns out that intersex conditions, so people who are born with what we might call ambiguous genitalia or secondary sex characteristics that develop in a way and differently from how we would expect them to based on that person's assigned sex, those conditions, like those sort of ways of being, and there's actually dozens of different ways that a person can be intersex, they're way, way, way more common than we're led to believe. I didn't know that a person could be intersex. I didn't know that was a thing until my late teens.
Yeah, me too.
Mid to late teens,
I
20s.
think I was maybe even 20s,
Yeah. No one talks about it. I think the only way I was able to sort of learn about it is through the trans community, actually, because historically trans and intersex people, their communities have been allied, and we share a lot of lived experiences, though we're not always overlapping Venn diagram circles. So those are way more common than, intersex people exist and are around and we know them. It's not a marginal experience by any means.
And that's even on a chromosomal level, right? It's not the case that it's a simple XXXY. There are different combinations that align with different...
there are women. There are like women who would present as cis women and who would never be seen as anything other than a cis woman who have a Y chromosome.
All right. So I think one of the reasons this can be really hard for people to grasp is I think humans in general need shortcut ways to sum each other up. Like we want to be able to look at each other. We want visual cues and just to be able to kind of get a picture of who a person is, right? And even a lot of transgender folks, I think, want to present on one end of the binary or another. I think there's still a lot of social pressure or social expectations or social conditioning that happens there that, to transition kind of happens on a scale. Some people really want to transition in a way that helps them present as female, very female, feminine, femme. Other people want to present as masculine, more male. But non-binary folks don't always really feel comfortable at either end of that pole. And so here's a quote from you. You say, a genderqueer person will most likely have been raised as either male or female, and most likely will have either a penis or vagina and attendant chromosomes and hormones, but will not feel that either of these labels suits them wholly. They might feel that both or neither of those labels applies. So this is, again, even with trans folks, the binary is strong. And we have genderqueer or non-binary folks that challenge that polarity.
Well, I mean, that's why we're here, isn't it? So we do, I think, like categories. We like binaries. As people, we like to be able to make quick assumptions. And I don't know if that's an inherent thing for human brains or if it's something that we're really taught, but it does take a lot of work to kind of get beyond those. For me, I had to do a lot of thinking, a lot of research, a lot of writing and talking to people. I had to be on Tumblr for quite a long time before I could get sort of my brain out of these really rigid categories that I had been thinking in. And, in a way, that's a privilege. But I think, the more you do it, it's a kind of skill. It's like critical thinking, this idea of this way of being able to question the categories that you're given. And, as a non-binary person, I'm quite grateful that I'm able to kind of exist between. I feel like it gives me a lot of freedom to play, to question, to challenge. Yeah.
I think the more non-binary and genderqueer folks people get to know, the more automatic it can become. I think even with pronouns, I have a coworker, they, them pronouns, and they're the second person that I've really spent a lot of time with. And it took a little while to figure out, to be able to automatically think instead of translating it, instead of looking at them and having to like decide to use their preferred pronoun, to it becoming automatic. And I also found that just using they, them more generally helped do that as well. So referring to people as they, them, just kind of more broadly. So familiarity helps a lot, but also it can be challenging because we don't necessarily know that we're running into people who might be non-binary all the time. And it's, as you say in the book, it's hard to even get estimates of how many people actually identify as non-binary. So that's part of the challenge, I think, too.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and that's one of the problems with, that's why it's so hard to be genderqueer and non-binary, or one of the reasons is a lot of our social systems are built around these very rigid categories. So when you break them, you stop being kind of intelligible to the system that you exist in. If I am non-binary, but I have to choose M or F on a form, I sort of get erased as a person.
Yeah, that's right. So you're facing this on forums, you're facing this as people are interacting with you. And from my perspective as a cisgendered person encountering a non-binary person, my impulse has been to think, what are they really? Or like, who,
Mm,
basically thinking still in terms of what gender they were assigned at birth and then triangulating from that. And so I think people are tempted to ask invasive questions about that. Like, it's really not my business what gender you or anyone else was assigned at birth. And the more I've been familiar with actual non-binary folks and hanging out
mhm.
with them, the less that impulse exists to try to see them initially as, oh, what are they really? Or where's their transness? Where are they transitioning away from? But instead just seeing them
Yeah.
as they are.
Well, I mean, when you were taught that binary gender is the only thing, your brain is naturally gonna go and try and fit the person
Hmm.
you're talking to into one or the other category. And yeah, and the only really way to do it, the easiest way is to just get to know people and talk to people, as you say.
Do you have to resist that too? Like, does the impulse I'm talking about sound familiar to you about when you see someone and as they present, your brain starts to automatically do this processing of like what their gender identity is? And because we're in such a cisgender heavy society, it seems like that would kind of be a default. Maybe I'm just guessing. I'm interested in your thoughts about this. Maybe
Mhm.
even for genderqueer folks that they might have that same kind of impulse. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're subject to the same social conditioning that everyone else is. Well, with it's different from individual to individual, but
Sure.
I definitely had to do a lot of, I guess you would call it, unlearning as I was writing the book and as I was getting to know myself. I had to let go of all of those impulses, or I can't even say that I did let go of them because it's a constant,
Hmm.
it's an ongoing process.
Right.
So I definitely had to do a lot of unlearning, and I have a lot of sort of, yeah, these sort of harmful or unproductive instincts of trying to, once I've sort of clocked someone, my brain automatically wants me to try and wonder, their sex assignment at birth, and
Yeah.
it's quite a harmful instinct and a hard one to get rid of, and I have managed to get rid of that instinct by being myself and being with other people in
Mm.
my community. I also wanted to loop back to the sort of that instinct of thinking, like what is the person's
Oh,
sort of
great. Yeah.
a
Yeah.
sex assignment at birth. I think that instinct to try and wonder about a person's sex assignment at birth, a lot of that comes from, or at least I think it comes from, the way that our society as a whole is really obsessed with bodies and specifically with categorizing bodies
Hmm.
and medicalizing bodies and pathologizing difference.
Hmm.
And this is kind of a instinct that exists on a lot of different levels, most often in the medical system,
Hmm.
but it kind of permeates throughout society. And that's kind of, it feels like a sort of very Western, very Anglophone instinct to seek some kind of essential truth
Hmm.
about a person. And I use that word essential truth not on its face value, but what we're seeking is we're taught to think that that is the truth of a person,
Hmm.
when in reality, the truth of a person doesn't have to have anything to do with, what's in their pants.
Hmm. Yeah.
But
Right.
I think there's a sort of deep historical process that's kind of still ongoing that contributes to this instinct that we have to clock people.
Yeah, I find myself in such a strange position about it because I think there's kind of this weird tension of like, it shouldn't matter all that much, but it also should matter because I also want to support folks who, especially marginalized folks, I want to understand their experiences. And there's legal issues, there's social pressures. I would shy away from like a gender blindness, I guess, or like a way of like erasing gender
Right.
identity, right?
Yeah, I think I remember back in so I was at university back in or undergrad
Hmm.
in mid 2010s, I guess. I don't know. And there was a lot of discourse around, can you be race
Hmm.
blind?
Right.
Can you be post
Yep.
racial? And I mean, like, no,
Yeah.
because you're a person who exists now. And regardless of whether biological sex or gender or even race, regardless of whether those things are actual quote unquote scientific realities, they affect the lived experience of real life people today.
Hmm.
So it's not really possible to be gender
Yeah.
blind. I think you're right to shy away from that impulse because I don't think it's necessarily a productive
Right.
one. That's kind of like saying, oh, can't we all just get along when you're talking about social inequality.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't want to be gender blind.
Yeah.
I want to celebrate people's genders. You know, I want to celebrate a trans woman's ability to joyfully embrace femininity and womanhood. I want to celebrate my own sort of in-betweenness and my own sort of playful way that I live my gender. So I think that there is some there's sort of impulses to be well-meaning impulses to be kind of quote unquote to not see gender. And I don't think that that's necessarily the most productive thing to do because I think we should be trying to celebrate difference.
I think the idea of like ignoring it is probably coming from a place of privilege. And what it really means is I'm not really comfortable with it. And so let's just not really talk about it. When people
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
When other people don't have that luxury of ignoring it. So, you know, you're also kind of a language nerd. You have a chapter in here about your training in linguistics that I wanted to talk about because this is a huge consideration. Language itself can be one of the biggest obstacles to social and legal acceptance of non-binary and genderqueer identities. So let's talk a little bit about that, even in the ways that different languages are structured. Like sometimes gender is literally baked into language.
So my publisher, when I wrote the book, they sent me a list of topics that they wanted to cover. And I think pronouns were on the list. But then I rubbed my hands together, like something about language, you say. So I am a big language nerd, and any chance I get to talk about it, I will take. Yeah, we've had the pronouns debate, and I think we're coming to the end of that debate. Maybe, I guess my political instinct would be, can we stop talking about pronouns and start talking about, suicide statistics, right? I mean, obviously we can talk about both, but I think this sort of debate, quote unquote, around, is it okay to use they, them pronouns? Whatever. But language does have a huge effect on our lived realities. And I mean, anyone who's studied any other languages knows that this can be totally different depending on what language you're speaking. Your ability to maintain your own autonomy when it comes to gender presentation. What does it mean for someone to be genderqueer or non-binary in a language, like Spanish, where if you speak about someone else, you basically have to assign them a gender?
A binary gender.
A binary gender, yeah. So that was the kind of questions that I had been trying to sort of get at. Well, and there's other languages like Japanese, for example, where gender is, well, and I mean, obviously there are caveats here because Japanese society, I mean, I'm not an expert, but it's not a wonderful place to be trans or non-binary or queer. But the language itself, just taken in a vacuum, you are allowed to basically claim gender for yourself, based on the personal pronouns you use, because you refer to yourself with a gender. You can use different forms of the word I, like I myself, based on how you see your own gender and your own sort of social. I haven't studied it in a while, but it's broadly gendered. And that's something that you can exercise autonomy in. So, I could use like boku if I wanted to be like slightly more masculine, but not as masculine as saying ore, for example.
That's interesting because like in these Japanese words could be seen as like over gendering things. But it also gives people the opportunity to play with language or to identify themselves and their gender identity kind of more on the fly and more subtly than having to say, my gender pronouns are this. Like you can just refer to yourself.
You can signal. You can signal to people in just the very on the fly.
Yeah, like if I was saying like, I'm glad to meet you, I can say that in a way that says like I, being a, non-cis person, or, they would look at me and what I look like, and I can give them gender clues just by saying, I'm glad to meet you.
Yeah, so it comes down to a part of gender presentation. And one of the people I spoke to in writing they, them, there is Japanese and specified, I asked them what their pronouns were, and they used they, them in English and boku in Japanese. So it's depending on the language you're speaking, the way that language shapes gender experience is different.
Yeah, you talk about there's natural gender in language, which is just the basic meaning of a word, right? Like woman, man, and different languages have these like natural gender. And then grammatical gender, all the ways that gender's embedded in language arbitrarily. So like in Spanish, there's
Table.
Yeah, your ways of signaling male and femaleness. And there's also, as you said in Japanese, this way of signaling gender in associated to other words, and even in phrases that you might use. Like there might be some phrases, social convention phrases that are more coded as masculine or feminine, even just in kind of the, I can't think of any examples, but I guess it might be like, let's say in English, saying holy cow would be like, oh, that's kind of like a boy thing to say. Like girls don't really say that. Like, but there's coded ways of even sending signals about your gender identity in phrases that you use.
Yeah, I think a lot of the ways that we ourselves use language is so gendered. Yeah, there's a lot of ways, at least in English, that a person is able to signal their own gender in the language that they use.
Oh, I guess even like swearing in English, it used to be more so in the past, but remember, that was not ladylike to use certain words. And so, we see it in English too. You mentioned the pronoun debate. I do think it's important to talk about why that is important, why that does matter to people. There's a quote here that I highlighted from the book. It says, the question at the heart of the pronoun debate is really fundamentally one about autonomy, the ability of a demographic, especially a marginalized one, to name itself and to claim agency or control over how it's referred to and by extension treated. And I think this is what makes some opponents and critics so uncomfortable with the pronoun debate is they don't want to give up control over defining other people.
Yes.
They perhaps feel that it's some sort of indictment even of themselves. And so it really boils down to
and sometimes it
control.
is.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So it's really a control issue and a dignity issue.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think, so when I'm like saying, oh, I don't think we need to have the pronouns debate anymore. I mean, I don't think we need to debate about whether it's grammatical anymore. But we
expand on that,
should be talking about.
You talk a little bit about that history too, because they, them, there for a singular. People say, oh, they, that's plural. It's not right to use that singularly. And your book is like, well, actually.
Yeah, I do a bit of a, well, actually.
Yes.
English has actually had neutral pronouns in it. Old English had them, and various times throughout history. People, I guess, may not know this, but language changes a lot over time. And so English actually has had neutral pronouns, at various times. I think Shakespeare used them, Jane Austen used them. So to say, oh, it's ungrammatical and it's a newfangled thing is pretty disingenuous.
People should know they as a singular pronoun actually is older than you as a singular pronoun. Like it was being used earlier than you. Let's talk about neopronouns too. This is where I feel like I have to resist being the old man on the porch shaking my fist at the youths, because when I start seeing all the differences, people might see pronouns like ZE and XE and VE. I think I'm not even 100% sure how to pronounce a lot of these, but like G, Jem, Jur, like I don't know. And so it's easy for me to be the old man on the porch. So give us some info about these newer pronouns.
At the time that I wrote the book, there were people who, and there still are people who use pronouns, I think ze, zir, he, here, like, which is like a sort of combination of, him and her, that use them. They sort of get conjugated, or they decline like any other set of pronouns. But truth be told, I don't personally know that many people that use neopronouns. And I wonder if that is because it's actually quite difficult to assert that. We're barely able to get people to not misgender us and to use they, them.
Like you said, there was a learning curve in being able to learn how to use they, them, their in the way that I can now. And so, it's a bigger lift when we're completely unfamiliar with new pronouns. I see the utility of them. I think it's cool. And I like how language changes to adapt to new realities. And maybe like 100 years from now, someone will like, you didn't know, but these pronouns have now ruled the day, and that'd be cool. Like that'd be awesome. But I just feel like that future is probably a long ways off.
Yeah, it does feel a long way off. And I almost wonder, I mean, I'll talk a little bit later about, probably about, this sort of backlash that we're experiencing, especially here in the UK. And I wonder if a lot of people who would otherwise be using neopronouns because they feel that that most accurately reflects who they are just sort of like, I can't fight with people anymore.
Exactly.
I'll just use they, them. Yeah.
This speaks to a broader issue of like the kind of fights that people are willing to have and the kind of rights that are at the forefront at the moment. And that's kind of a political calculation, which also means that some people get hurt in the meantime, and that pain exists in the meantime, and that there are priorities that are set, and there are imbalances of power, and people get to kind of decide okay, let's rally together. What are we going for right now? And choices have to be made. And I think that can be tricky, but it speaks to the fact that language is a power game too.
Oh, yeah.
All of this is wrapped up in a power. And not that everybody is even necessarily trying to exercise mean power over others, but sometimes we make mistakes. And I'm just looking for some tips from you about how people can handle it when they say, well, when you accidentally misgender somebody, for example, what's a good approach when that happens?
Yeah. So I guess going back to this idea of, we're not really trying to be the center of attention. I mean, even just because being the center of attention is quite dangerous. I think the best advice is to, sort of approach the interaction with good faith, understand that you may be hurting someone more than you personally are, can empathize with. And, there are certain situations that, where it's no one's fault. I guess my advice would be if you accidentally misgender someone or dead name someone, you don't need to make a big deal out of it. Make sure the person knows that you're sorry and that you're trying, but you don't need to necessarily go, oh God, I'm the worst. Oh no. I f***ed up so bad. Don't make it about you, but also don't put them in the spotlight. Like, you can correct yourself, say sorry, and then move on with the conversation. And maybe you can check in with that person later and say, are you okay? But we're all adults here. And there are ways of doing it sensitively, just as long as you're being as respectful as you can be. And
yeah. One thing I've been encouraged to resist too is to say something like, I hope you can be patient with me as I learn, or like, because again, that's sort of making it about me and putting an obligation on that person to police their own feelings, or to kind of maybe even feel shame if they feel angry or upset about it. Because
sometimes I can't be patient with someone. I just need to step away, like it's, that's a good point.
Oh, I love this in your book where you talk about that, where you're like, how does it feel to get misgendered? And you're like, well, it depends on the day. Like there's some days when I'm feeling fine, and like I see that as an annoyance, and it's like, okay, well, that's not really cool, but I can like move on. And then you can be in a different space at a different time when it hurts, or when it's like, oh man, or it depends on kind of your relationship to the person who's doing it, or like the situation. So there's no like one way it's received when someone gets misgendered. It really depends. And so I liked what you said of like, just being subtle about it, being straightforward, apologizing, and just, not making too big of a deal out of it either.
Yeah.
Because that puts more labor, I think, on a non-binary or non-gender conforming person.
Yeah. And I guess understand also that you can apologize and you should apologize, but the other person doesn't owe you forgiveness.
And don't feel resentful if they don't. Like, they have a whole backlog of experiences that your one comment one day can be added to. And so I think that's all about not making it about me. Again, I would be making it about me if I was like, well, they should forgive me. And if they don't, then that's a problem, or they're a bad person or whatever.
Yeah.
Would be centering myself. And I've been working harder at not centering myself as much, especially coming from like a more privileged position, a more being cis het, I'm seen, perceived, and being a white male, I'm perceived as being, kind of the default, or the with all the privilege that brings. So, and I think it's helpful to keep in mind too that it can be really hurtful. And other times it can just be annoying and, whatever. So I think being attuned to that is helpful. So, all right.
Yeah.
I want to remind people, Eris Young is our guest today in this episode, and we're talking about the book They, Them, Their, A Guide to Non-Binary and Queer Identities. This is a great book, and I really, Eris, am so glad that we're able to sit down and talk with you about it today. We've got some more stuff to cover. I want to talk about the community thing. It's Pride Month, by the way. Happy Pride, Eris.
Happy Pride.
And so let's look at this acronym, LGBTQ. I've also seen it expanded to LGBTQIA+, and there are kind of different iterations of it. It didn't occur to me until pretty recently, the way that the acronym breaks down, like the first few letters pertain more to sexual orientation, lesbian, gay, bi, and then we start to get to like gender identity, trans, queer, the TQ, and I, intersex, asexuality. The plus means, can extend to like pansexual and maybe like aromantic. And there's all sorts of things, right? But it's interesting to me that it's not, it's not organized in a way that distinguishes between sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and so on. It's all kind of lumped together as these marginalized identities. And what that means is the LGB part of it can be really binary and even transphobic as well, even though the letter T appears in the bigger acronym. So let's talk about the LGBTQ community and how you address that in the book and some of the nuances that people miss that aren't really in those communities.
Yeah. LGBTQ plus, etc. are, it's an umbrella term. It is an expression of a shared experience of marginalization in terms of sex, gender, and sexuality. So naturally, that means that it's not a monolith, and there are always going to be conflicts within the community. We've got some, what do I want to say about this?
Yeah, it can be true. Like the fact that you paused a little bit, what is that coming from? Just trying to organize your thoughts, or are there some anxieties too about kind of unpacking this stuff?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a little bit of anxiety there in terms of, as you mentioned earlier, we're under a lot of pressure, especially right now, to present a unified front to the rest of the world. We have to act in solidarity with each other. The same people who are trying to take rights away from transgender people, if they succeed in 5 years, they'll be coming after gays and lesbians who've just only recently managed to secure, any kind of real legal or social security. Like, we all need to be acting in solidarity with each other, but that's not always possible. And I think there is a lot of conflict. So, when you see LGB and then you go T and then you go Q and queer, that sort of articulates a division within the community that I can see, which is you have assimilationist, usually LGB people, most often cis. And then you've got queer, trans, ace people who are more often or more likely, at least from my view, to be anti-assimilationist, who are more likely to want to reject the entire institution of marriage because of an understanding, that marriage is a part of a sort of heteronormative system. It can't be decoupled from that. So I think there are divisions within the community, and a lot of the communities that I belong to, the genderqueer and trans communities, I do consider myself to be queer. I think that's a term that a lot of us, a more capacious term that a lot of us use to describe ourselves. I'm trans and I'm also asexual. So I'm a triple threat of like anti-assimilationist queerness, because those are the identities that don't really slot in easily into the existing system. There's been a lot of campaigning historically for gays and lesbians to be able to marry. Though there is marriage, quote unquote, marriage equality in a lot of countries now, non-binary people who don't have one or the other gender marker, often we are excluded from those so-called, equal marriages. So I think it's inherent to some identities, or, and obviously these identities don't have firm boundaries between them, but there's a lot of types of ways of being, of lived experience that don't have the luxury or the privilege of being able to assimilate. And don't have the option to, I think, you see pride. You see a lot of corporations getting involved with pride now because we've realized, or the corporations have realized, that the gays have money now. And a lot of us don't have money yet. I mean, I think, the T, that's the poorest subgroup within the LGBTQIA plus.
Yeah, economically speaking, like you can see, like lower incomes, more difficult job opportunities.
Yeah, like housing,
education, discrimination. Yeah,
all sorts. And that
violence committed against.
Yep,
yeah,
absolutely.
I think there's been some temptation by old school LGB to kind of like throw that under the bus a little bit. Like they would say, like I've heard this, like we fought for certain rights and we got to protect those, and we don't really get this other thing and don't feel obligated to it. And so they kind of want to separate that out and maybe even display blatant transphobia. Like it's not the case that just because someone identifies as lesbian, gay, or bi, that they're going to be an ally of trans folks. That's just not a guarantee.
Yeah. And I think that's something that at least I, maybe naively, have sort of been quite surprised and disappointed at. I come in good faith to the community, and then I find that some people don't want me there. It can be quite frustrating. It undermines the solidarity that we're gonna need in order to like survive, the next 10, 20, 50 years. Yeah, it's quite disappointing to see. I do want to say at this point that I think the handful of gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, I think it's mainly like cis gays and lesbians who are exhibiting transphobia. I think that's a very vocal, very limited minority. I think the vast majority of cis gays and lesbians are wholly supportive of the trans community and fully understanding that our rights and our rights to, dignity, healthcare, stability, security, they're all interconnected. And I think most people within the community do understand that and are working alongside us. But there is a vocal and influential minority within the LGBTQ plus community working against full equality, the full equality of the umbrella as a whole. And it's quite hard to see.
And these are folks that are going to get platformed too. I think one of the dangers is there's credibility in the eyes of transphobic folks. If, here's this person.
We have a gay that we can wheel out who hates trans people. Exactly. That means that the whole community. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And this happens with people who have detransitioned that can then a very small number of folks who transition, then detransition, and
for any number of reasons.
Right, for any number of reasons. And then an even smaller subset of that then becomes sort of spokespeople against trans rights and are platformed and given huge audiences. Simply
because they are able to pander to that transphobic sort of ideology.
It can be really tricky. It's heartening to hear that solidarity continues. I think your book does a good job of talking about the necessary community building that has to happen if people are going to advance rights and protections and celebrations too. It's also not just about protection. It's also about celebration and embrace and acceptance and curiosity and exploring. I think that's important as well. And
absolutely.
As your book talks about mental health issues, I think that's a good transition into that topic, because your chapter on mental health is especially careful, because some people believe that identifying beyond the binary or outside of it is itself a mental health problem. So this has been pathologized even in scientific Enlightenment thinking, as scientists in the late 1800s are trying to classify things and seeing non-binary and trans as pathological. Talk about the trickiness of mental health, because on the one hand, it's been pathologized and in negative ways. And then on the other hand, mental health issues do exist within the trans and non-binary communities, in part because of the pressures that surround it. So mental health is a real concern, but it can also be deployed in really negative ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think you pretty much said it. The mental health chapter in my book, and that was one of the topics that I knew from the beginning that I wanted to talk about. And that was because I wanted to know what was going on. I think that chapter for me was all about trying to pick apart where these negative mental health outcomes actually come from. Because, we've got these two on the surface, these two facts that seem to contradict each other. We have, on the one hand, documented disproportionate experiences of mental illness within the trans, non-binary, and genderqueer communities. Right. And on the other side, you have this understanding, and this was intuitive for me, this understanding that there is nothing wrong with being trans or being non-binary. It's not an illness. It's just another way of being in the world. So I really wanted, in writing that chapter, to try and dig a little deeper and get at what was really going on. And what I basically found was that it's a combination of gender dysphoria and marginalization stress, which is this sort of experience, this way of describing the negative mental health outcomes, anxiety, depression, that come when a person is living as a marginalized person. Any kind of minority might experience this, but it's just sort of the stresses of dealing with microaggressions, the everyday stress of being misgendered, of just sort of feeling like you don't fit and that society isn't built for you.
Right. And these are physical things that happen, right? Mm-hmm. You talk about like blood pressure elevation, more stress hormones being released, which is really hard on the body. It impacts mental and physical health. So when people feel these marginalized stressors, it has physical impacts. So as you said, if you were to set a group of non-binary folks or trans folks and a group of cis-het folks next to each other, you're going to see a disproportionate amount of marginalized folks with depression, anxiety, and other things. So it would be easy to say, oh, you see, those people are kind of just broken people, and their gender identity issues are wrapped up in because they have mental problems or they're depressed, or it's part of all that. Instead of saying, oh, actually, there's nothing wrong with who they are, but what they experience causes these negative outcomes. That's a crucial distinction to make.
Yeah, it's a really crucial distinction, but it's also quite a pernicious assumption. I can easily see where it comes from. When you have someone whose existence challenges people in positions of power, I can see why it was very convenient for people in, medical institutions to be able to say, it's an illness. Look how depressed they are, and just by that sort of brush queers, trans people under the rug.
You talk about in the book, there's also a chapter specifically about medical issues in particular, which is another touchy subject. And as you've already hinted at, there's some distrust there between genderqueer folks, trans folks, and medical resources and medical practitioners because of this history of diagnosis, this history of assuming that these identities are disorders, and a history of attempts to cure them. We think of conversion therapy today as sort of a religiously grounded thing, and I think there are religious groups that are still trying to practice it. But it also grew out of the medical industry and out of psychology. Yep. So this wasn't just like religious fundamentalists that wanted to fix gay people or to fix trans people, but rather medical industry saying, oh, is there a way we can fix this problem for them so that their gender aligns with their sex? And that's a long history.
So that they reintegrate into society.
Exactly right. And this is where it's tricky because also medical advances have helped with, hormone blockers and helping people medically transition, whether it be through hormones, whether it be through surgical procedures. But behind all of that is a lot of baggage and ongoing distrust.
Yeah. So I think trans people tend to be put in this, trans people who decide that they want to transition medically, whatever that means for them, are put, in this contradictory position where you are forced to rely on a system that has consistently dehumanized and pathologized you and people like you. And that can create a lot of trauma. It's like being in a position where someone has hurt you and you have to see that person every day. It can be quite harmful. And, that really does come down to this sort of post-European Enlightenment kind of shift in mindset that made us start to see biological sex as a kind of scientific reality and to uphold that as the most important thing. And it also comes down to the way that, we have this system of capitalism that kind of exploded after the Industrial Revolution. And you had, men and women's social roles become more and more divergent from each other. So, women were increasingly relegated to the home and men were increasingly placed in positions of economic power that were now outside the home. And what that meant was that, for men in power, it was very convenient for them to use this sort of new scientific knowledge to make claims about the people that they wanted to exclude from power. Usually this was women, but it's been weaponized against, trans people, colonized people, queer people generally since that time.
That there's something inherently inferior about them, right?
Yeah, inferior, broken, and that somehow being unwilling or unable or refusing to conform to a very specific norm is a moral failing and an illness.
And hey, we can fix it using science.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, the community, we have this assimilationist and anti-assimilationist groups getting in conflict with each other because, society offers you a way to kind of re-enter society, like come back to the bosom of society. Yeah. And all you have to do is promise not to challenge it, the people in power anymore.
Right.
And it's really tempting. And I can see why people fall into that.
And that can even happen in the process of transitioning too. We're staring down the barrel of all these new laws that people are trying to pass that prevent gender affirming medical care, especially for young people. And it's at a critical time. I mean, the idea of puberty blockers is to prolong a time when a young person can come to terms with who they are.
Just some breathing space. Yeah. To kind of get to know yourself a bit better.
And they want to be like, oh, that's too dangerous, so let's just cut that completely off. And then they can decide when they're older. But that means a body has undergone changes that it didn't necessarily have to begin with, right? And so there's a sense of like the medical community is offering options now for people to take more control over their identities and their presentation in ways that alleviate suicidality and that are super helpful.
But it's also complicit.
Right. This part fascinated me, where you talked about, for example, a care provider that you had who thought you were transitioning to like male and like was prescribing testosterone and was like, oh, your levels aren't where they should be. And you're like, oh, interesting. But you also couldn't say well, they're where I want them to be,
Yeah. Like it sort of puts you in this position of having to misrepresent yourself. And I think this is not as common anymore. I mean, here in the UK, we do have gender identity clinics. For how much longer we'll have those, I do not know. But I do know that a few people I've spoken to have accessed those services now. There are people who are being very open about their non-binary identity and their desire to transition in a way that isn't strictly from one end of the pole to another.
I'm pausing the interview for a quick second with an update because Eris's words about care being under threat were prescient. Since we recorded the interview months ago, the UK has paused the prescription of puberty blockers for minors under the advice of a partisan report produced by Dr. Hilary Cass, who other reporters say has worked with anti-trans activist groups and conversion therapists. To get a better sense about why prescriptions are being paused, I suggest following independent reporters who've been covering these stories. Aaron Reed and Evan Urquhart are two of my favorite resources to go to. I hope to cover more about these recent studies and these laws later on the show. Back to Eris Young. Give us like a 60-second snapshot of what the process generally looks like for a young person who, let's say from a very young age, they've talked about not being a boy or a girl, or maybe they've talked about being a gender that they weren't assigned at birth. What does the process look like to transition? And there are many different ways to transition. So just kind of give us a snapshot of what people go through.
It varies a lot between the US and the UK and from state to state, obviously, and, country to country, region to region. I think rural trans people will experience, for example, using gender identity services in the UK a lot differently than someone who's based in a city. So, somebody might, if they're very young, they might be able to access puberty blockers. That would only be for a short period of time they would be prescribed. They are not generally prescribed longer than a few years, from my understanding. And that would just give them a little bit of breathing space, because usually generally at the point of access, of the first point of entry into the sort of gender identity medical system, that's the moment at which a child is able to declare, there's something going on with me and I want to explore it, in more depth. Mm-hmm. And so, at the point of being prescribed puberty blockers, that would just give them a little bit of breathing room to talk to people, hopefully. I mean, I'm of two minds about speaking to a cis therapist about gender stuff, but, like explore the community, explore their options, think about what kind of gender presentation feels right for them, think really long and hard about what kind of medical transition they might want to undergo or not undergo at all. And then, after a few years, they would then, in an ideal world, access either and or hormone replacement therapy, so testosterone or estrogen, while this whole time they'll be transitioning socially, ideally, if it's safe to do so, exploring, different names, different pronouns. I actually don't know if this is the lived reality of people right now. I'm sure in very progressive cities it probably is, but the reality, I'm sure, is much more difficult than I'm making it out to be.
Right. Well, this is the impression that I think opponents have, is this idea that it's super easy and that these kids are being manipulated, or, the word is groomed that people use, this a term that has been rightly used to talk about adults pressuring children into sexual situations.
Well, conversion therapy.
Yeah. Or conversion therapy. Right. But they're trying to use it as though these people are trying to brainwash kids into thinking they're different.
And that's the same kind of, bullshit that was said about gay people back in like the 80s or 90s. Like, oh, they're grooming our children and making them gay. And it's like, no, we f***ing aren't. So
yeah. Opponents of gay marriage would say we can't have gay men in particular father children because what they really want to do is, abuse kids or whatever. Like, we're seeing those exact same arguments play out here. And for anyone who's spent any time with a kid who identifies as trans, like, good luck trying to convince them of something else, or of trying to like I can barely get my kid to like brush his teeth every night, or like, so there's the sense that it's way too easy, that it's coercive, that kids aren't interested in this really.
It's the reverse. It's the kids that are educating themselves and, coming to this with clear eyes and letting go of this social programming that they've had. Like, the kids are so much more conversant with all of this stuff than I was at their age. And and they should be supported in that.
And the parents I see are involved. They're very, I have to say, like, there's nervousness, there's anxiety and fear and love and all kinds of emotions that they're dealing with. It's not this simple process. Your book is really helpful in laying out why these processes are necessary and helpful, and also some of the downsides. It's really clear-eyed about some changes that could improve the system, a more patient-centered, informed consent models, where medical professionals are laying out options and talking about drawbacks and talking about side effects and talking about possibilities.
Yeah. I think the biggest change that I think needs to happen within the medical community is to understand or to acknowledge that trans people are the experts on their own lived experience and are capable of making informed decisions for themselves. And are best placed to make informed decisions for themselves, not some, faceless gender recognition panel of old cis people. So, I think that's the biggest change that I'd like to see in the medical system. And I have no idea if we'll ever get there.
Speaking of changes, let's also talk about legal issues. So non-binary folks are most concerned with two particular factors you say in the book. First, they need basic legal recognition of their identities, especially on official documents, birth certificates, and other things. And then second, with greater visibility will come a greater need for legal protection from discrimination, from violence. And those are kind of the big things. Tell us what legal protections exist now and what legal protections you'd really like to see happen that don't exist mostly.
Yeah, so it's a little tricky. These things are changing all the time.
And they vary by country.
They vary
right?
by country. They vary over time. They walk forward and get knocked back. Just last year in the UK, we saw Scotland vote by a pretty solid majority to reform the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland, which would have made it So this was the Scottish people voting in favor of making the sort of legal process and medical process for transitioning easier and more humane. It would allow people to start the process younger, and it would eliminate some of the more sort of dehumanizing and traumatic aspects of the current UK gender recognition system. And then what we saw was that Westminster, so the overarching government of the UK, which is a conservative government run by the Tory party, Boris Johnson and that, or whoever they've got down there now, they simply decided to ignore it. They saw that Scotland had voted, exercised a democratic process, and they decided not to uphold it. So the Gender Recognition Act has not been reformed, even though Scotland voted to do it. And so, we've seen even in the course of 1 year, massive progress and massive walking back of that progress because of a transphobic government that the UK has. So it really varies a lot, and it's all extremely in flux right now. So on the other side of the Atlantic, we can see, so I'm pretty excited that I've now been able to, I think at the beginning of last year, I applied for a passport just at the time that Joe Biden announced that you could now get an X on your gender marker. So I got that, which was very cool. And I also just received, or rather, I filled out my application and then had to come back to the UK. But so in my mom's house right now, there's a driver's license for me with the next gender marker on it that I have to go and get. But so I've got these, non-binary friendly, inclusive gender markers on my driver's license, and fair play to California. Literally all I had to do was fill out a gender declaration form. It was like, it took a minute to fill it out. It was super easy. So I'm really grateful, that my family's based in California. I think we have a lot of rights that other, queers in other states don't. And, something that I'm kind of wondering is, the more we see these, we see progress being made in one area, for example, in legal documentation. What then does that mean, for example, to the criminal justice system, or I should say, quote unquote, justice system? Yeah. What happens to a person who is, legally, and this is all like theoretical. So what happens to somebody with an X gender marker on their documentation if they get arrested, if they become incarcerated?
Yeah, if they're incarcerated, where do they go? If prisons are separated by binary, where would they go, right?
I mean, yeah, so is it possible to change your birth certificate right now? I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it. And if it is, how much longer will we have that privilege or that right of being able to do that? But the more we change things, the more we start to see how entrenched binary gender is throughout the entire system. Obviously, what passes for a criminal justice system in the United States is fundamentally broken and needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. And part of that is going to be, how is sex and gender treated within that system? And I don't know if anyone has done any kind of formal study of people with non-binary legal documentation, or of just of non-binary people within the criminal justice system in the States. But I'd be very interested to see what they're finding, because, it would just be another layer of complication on an already horrific experience.
And then we're also seeing just even general access to care being affected in places. Utah, where I'm meeting you from, has passed legislation to prevent gender-affirming care for minors, and it's causing so much pain and damage. And hopefully the courts can help address that, but that remains to be seen. So legally, it feels like we have a long way to go, and I think it's going to be a heavier lift in some ways than gay marriage, because cis-het people could, I think, more easily wrap our heads around gay marriage. It was just like, oh, these people want to get married. Cool.
This is like us asking for a separate thing. It's not an assimilation. It's we're asking for actual change, not just to access an existing,
to be yourselves. Yeah, let us be us, not let us be like you.
Quite.
Yeah, so I don't know. With that in mind, are you generally optimistic? Let's kind of close on that. What are some reasons for optimism maybe, and some things to kind of keep our eyes on?
So I think something that I kind of find reassuring is that, it's not the same all over the world right now. We are seeing backlash, but it's not the same. So one of my friends here in Scotland, they're non-binary and their son is trans, and they just went to Canada and stayed there for a good few weeks. And they said that they actually felt safer and more seen and more understood than they had in years living in the UK. And it wasn't just that there are legal recognitions over there, it's the way that they were treated in the day to day by normal, everyday cis people, just regular people, treated them with respect and understanding. And they said they just didn't want to leave. So in a way, it is cause for optimism because it makes me think it's not this way everywhere and it doesn't have to be. But at the same time, it's quite depressing because, we can't all move to Canada. I mean, there's space there, but
Right.
Yeah. So I want to believe that it won't be like it is in the UK or the US, certain parts of the USA forever. And I have to hope. But at the same time, and I think directly correlated with the increase in visibility that trans and non-binary people have had. In recent years, we've become really visible. We've been able to, we've just been really visible and uncompromising when it comes to claiming space and claiming language for ourselves. And what that means is that there are a lot of people, especially people in power, who are made upset by that, who are afraid of it because it makes them think about themselves and think about their own position in the world. And if they acknowledge us, then they have to question a lot of the things that they've based their whole lives around. And because they're people in power, they've applied an equal and opposite pressure to our own, attempts to demand rights and equality. So I think the next 10 years is going to be really difficult.
Well, from where I sit, this is complete theory. I don't have any, there's no study backing this theory that I have. But I have a theory that there are more people who would be supportive of non-binary identities, that there are more people who could come to easily understand trans folks and their experiences, and that the opposition is a very dedicated, vocal, and powerful minority of voices who have a disproportionate impact on what policies are passed, on how people are treated. And what that means to me is, if that's true, that puts more onus on me to use my voice and my position to advocate for equality and for greater understanding, and that it really becomes these sort of middle grounders or kind of folks who are like, yeah, that sounds fine to me, but I'm also living my life over here. That's who I want to really start paying attention, because most queer folks are already in the fight. They kind of have to be. Some take breaks here and there or just kind of want to hop out because otherwise they might end their lives or something. But for me, I want these folks who are just kind of interested, maybe kindly, curious, to be more than that.
Yeah.
And to be embracing and to be vocal. And to use our voices to show that there are numbers behind this and that this is a pathway to a better society. Now, I don't know. As I said, I haven't seen stats on that. I don't know. But I do think that that's the case. I hope it is. And that's one of the reasons I am thankful for folks like you sharing your story and sharing your knowledge, because that's a huge labor in and of itself, in addition to just being who you are in a society that can be oppressive. And so I want to just close with that gratitude to you for helping educate me and others with this really great book, They, Them, There. And I just want to say thanks.
Well, right by Catchy Blair. I'm really, excited that you've invited me on here. I'm really happy to be able to talk about my work and sort of, share it with more and more people. I really appreciate your questions. They've been very challenging and really getting to the heart of kind of what I'm trying to do with this book. So I'm also very grateful to you.
Oh, thanks. Let's conclude with our little game that I like to play at the end. It's a little choose your own adventure. It's called Regrets, Challenges, Surprises. You can speak to one, you can speak to two, you can speak to all three. It's just, is there anything you regret about the book? Was there anything specifically challenging about the book you didn't anticipate ahead of time? Or was there anything a big thing that you learned, something that was really surprising? You can speak to one, two, or all three of those.
Yeah. So I think I'll talk on regrets and surprises. And I think one of the things that I would do differently now, if I were to write the book again, is I might, if you've read my second book, Ace Voices, I talk a lot about that, is this idea of a dictionary as a kind of coercive tool. This idea that if you write something down and you write a definition, if you give an identity term a definition, then that kind of makes it rigid. It solidifies it. Where in reality, it might be more fluid and more, unresolved. So I think I would handle my definitions of terms with a little bit more nuance, maybe, or a more mindful way of talking about sort of definitions of terms. But I did manage to do that in my second book. So I'm happy with that.
And let me say, I have read your second book, and we will awesomely be talking with you about it in a later episode. Thanks for being willing to do it. And it's about ace voices. It's going to be great. So yes, I did notice that. And it seems like a book about asexuality is kind of primed to call that out and to say, hey, let's be more careful with rigid definitions. Anyway, we'll talk about that. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
But all right. Surprises. What surprised you?
I think the thing that really surprised me was, that idea of, biological sex is actually fake. Gender is a conspiracy. It goes all the way to the top, just sort of like realizing that all of these systems of everything from, binary gender to capitalism to colonialism, they're all the same system. And that was something that I found really difficult to hold in my brain at one time. And it kind of, that was part of the thing about the book, and with Ace Voices as well, that, sort of broke my brain into little pieces so that I could start putting it back together again.
The social construction of this stuff is when you can start really wrapping your head around it. And it's not this like aimless relativism that has no roots in, it's not saying anything goes. It's a recognition of how humans make decisions and are influenced to make decisions about how we view the world, about what's possible in the world, about what's possible for ourselves and for others, and how those things are negotiable and how they change. And it's not a linear line that goes straight, like, the moral arc of the universe toward justice. It's not like that either.
Yeah, exactly.
It requires active work and involvement. And I feel similar to that in how I've come to understand these issues myself as well. And for me, it actually began in disability studies, which I did for my master's degree. Yeah. And
yes, there's so much overlap there.
Yeah.
There's so much work being done in disability activism right now.
Social construction, like the ways that we build our society create and exacerbate disabilities and make them what they are. Like, we have other choices. And I hope people will pick up this book, Eris, They, Them, There. It's a great way to answer a lot of questions that you might feel reluctant about asking a friend or family member. And it can help spark conversations. Like, you could maybe bring the book to a friend. Hey, what do you think about this? Here's something Eris said. What do you think? Because you're not the be-all, end-all definer, and you don't try to be. So it can also educate, but also give opportunities for people to have conversations with people that they want to get to know better. So it's really useful for that.
Well, I'm very happy to hear you say that. It means a lot.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Eris. This has been a great discussion. And again, the book is They, Them, There, A Guide to Non-Binary and Queer Identities. Eris also serves as fiction editor at Shoreline of Infinity sci-fi magazine, and previously was the writer-in-residence at Lighthouse in Edinburgh. It's Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop. You were there from 2019 to 2022. So, all right, Eris, we'll look forward to talking to you again. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much for having me. See you again.
Thanks for listening, and special thanks to Camille Messick, my wonderful transcript editor, and also to David Ostler, who sponsored this first group of transcripts. And I'm looking for more transcript sponsors. They're not free, so help me out. If you've got a little extra money lying around, my email address is blair@firesidepod.org. You can help me get these transcripts out. We do a full transcript of every episode. You can also contact me at that email address with any questions or feedback about any of the episodes we've done so far, or ideas you have about future episodes. There's a lot more to come. And this is also the moment where I do the thing that you hear on so many of the podcasts you listen to. I'm going to ask you to rate and review the show in Apple Podcasts or in Spotify. Let me know what you think about it. Here's a new 5-star review from Ariel Munyer. They say, I love the wide variety of family structures this podcast seeks to highlight. So many interesting books and guests.
Hey, Ariel, thanks for that. And I agree. I'm having a great time producing the show. I love all the different books and guests I've been able to learn from. And I enjoy hearing from people who like listening to it. All right, one more thing. The number one way that people hear about podcasts is through a friend, through word of mouth. So as you listen to this episode, maybe a friend of yours or a family member or somebody came to mind. It reminded you of somebody. Maybe send this episode their way. That might be just the person who needs to hear it, and I appreciate it. Thanks to Mates of State for providing our theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm Blair Hodges, and I'll see you next time. Thanks to Mates of State for providing our theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm Blair Hodges, and I'll see you next time.